My name is Mark Ledbury. I'm the director of the Power Institute and the chair of the Art History Department here at the University of Sydney. I would like first to acknowledge that the campuses of the University of Sydney are built on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I would like to welcome you all here and remind you that highlight, though, tonight is we're not done with Power events for the semester, and that next week we celebrate with 4A, an institution which, as you will know, has grown to be one of the most important of our neighbours and cultural institutions here, celebrating the contemporary in Asian art, and we are joining with them in a symposium convened by Michaela Tai and by Stephen Whiteman, our departmental colleague here, and that symposium happens on the 4th of November, next Friday. It is technically sold out, which means that the places have been all grabbed. However, those of you really keen, who really want to go, might find that the odd place or two is liberated. So I would not despair if you really want to go. But it's a very exciting event, and that happens next Friday. And then on the 10th of November, we have a distinguished visitor. Apinan Poshiananda is here to talk on Southeast Asian art, a talk titled Playful Body, Playful Politics, the Southeast Asian Contemporary Art and its place amidst changes in the international art world. And that, as you might have seen from the rolling screen up here, is the first of our Kia Foundation lectures, bringing major curators and curatorial voices, artists and others to both Melbourne and Sydney to give talks, and that's sponsored by a generous grant from the Kia Foundation. So, on to tonight. The main focus of tonight is, of course, it's my great pleasure to introduce Tamar Garb, who is the Durning Lawrence Professor in the History of Art and now the Director of the UCL Institute of Advanced Studies at University College London. And as many of you will know, she's an art historian renowned in at least two fields. Her early work placed her at the centre of a feminist reappraisal of Impressionist and post-Impressionist art. Her work at once a critical rereading of major works from Cézanne to Berthe Morisot, a new and historically revealing chronicle of the careers of women artists, and a significant intervention into the wider discussion of canon and genre, with wide relevance to the way we make and tell the history of art way beyond the chronological limits of her own specialism. She's the author of many books, articles, and essays, including Sisters of the Brush, 1994, the breakthrough study of the Union of Women Painters and Sculptors, as you will know, of Bodies of Modernities, Figure and Flesh in Fin siècle France from 1998, The Painted Face, Portraits of Women in France, 1814-1914, that came out in 2007, The Body in Time, Figures of Femininity in 19th Century France, 2008, and that's just the tip of a very large iceberg of very prominent and important articles, books, and chapters. In more recent work, Tamar has deepened her scholarly engagement with contemporary art practices, principally, I think it may be fair to say, focusing on women artists. She's written eloquently on Mona Hatoum. She's particularly focused on South African photography and on painting more recently. Her Figures and Fictions, Contemporary South African Photography, came out in 2011, and African Photography from the Walter Collection, Distance and Desire, Encounters with the African Archive, a collection of ambitious essays on a subject not very well known, she edited and wrote in 2014. And it's to the South African-born artist Marlene Dumas that Tamar has recently turned her attention, uniting her interests in African contemporary art and culture with a long-standing exploration of women artists and creators. And it's part of that project that we're going to be hearing tonight. And her talk tonight is entitled Painting, Photography, Politics, Marlene Dumas and the Figuration of Difference. Please welcome Tamar Garb.
Thank you so much, Mark. Let me just end this show and put on another show, which is, this one, sorry. Okie doke, we'll get there. Great. Thank you very much for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. It's 20 years since I lectured in Sydney, or visited Sydney, so it's really lovely to be here and to see many familiar faces. Okay. Photographs provide the scaffolding for two quite distinctive paintings made nearly 30 years apart. Both are from the hand of the South African-born Dutch resident Marlene Dumas. Both are executed in oil on canvas and have manifestly magnified their image source, liquefied its surface patina, added colour to its monochromatic sobriety, and displaced its earlier space of circulation. In both instances, the gestural marks of the painter overwrite the archival precedents, at once invoked and supplanted, whether drawn from the private family album or taken from the popular press. In the case of the school group portrait, the specific source of the image is so generic and ubiquitous so as to be in itself almost redundant. Never mind that we can trace the actual photograph on which the painting is based, or that we can identify the yellow-haired child behind the teacher as that of the artist herself. The reference here, though, is to the typical and typological rather than to the unique or distinctive. In transforming the modest source into an oil painting, Dumas, in fact, cut off two children on the right and two on the left in order to concentrate and intensify the composition. They were simply the casualty of the artist's eye, whose first duty was to the coherence of her painting, not to a record or a literal transcription or repetition of a document. Now, those of us who grew up under the yoke of a British or colonial education can each reproduce a similar icon of our youth, in which we sit in our serried ranks, ankles carefully crossed, hands neatly clasped, ties obediently knotted, as we look awkwardly ahead for the camera. My own family album, like everyone else's, is furnished with just such a relic. Here we sit, girls in the front, boys towards the back, blazers and badges intact, in a frontal display of uniformity that belies the adolescent brooding and bravado of those times. I was 15 when this picture was taken, placed fourth from the left in row 2. But there's little visible difference between my teenage comportment and dress and that of the 6-year-olds of Marlene Dumas' own class. The group coheres as of one body, its identity marked by clothing, clasping, grinning and glaring, as the invisible photographer cajoles and controls from his spot. And the teachers are almost interchangeable. Blonde, coiffed hair, crossed ankles, clasped hands, buttoned up respectability. They seem to have emerged from the very same molds. What unites both these photographs in our memories, for Dumas and I come from similar places, she from a rural Afrikaner childhood on the winelands outside the Cape, I from closeted Jewish suburbia marooned on the edge of Table Mountain. But what unites the photographs is the unspoken glue of apparent ethnic homogeneity that framed the fact of our adherence to the set. To be part of such a classroom in South Africa in the mid to late 20th century was to be sucked into a segregated community in which a spurious sense of belonging was tied to language and custom and skin colour. Whiteness, above all, was what was registered in the performance and display of our identities. Black and white photography seemed to collude with the institutionalized naturalization of separation as it bleached out our skins and smoothed over our blemishes, the better to inscribe us as one of the group. The subtle but coercive effect of such images was to endorse and perpetuate the sense of belonging that the composition and costume enshrined. Now, Dumas' small act of retroactive painterly rebellion is to mimic the photograph's format, figuring the uniformity of furniture and repetitive pose, while refusing its bland, washed-out tonalities in favor of exuberant and fauve-derived hues. Puce and orange, green and turquoise. In Dumas' flamboyant reworking, the faces have become punctuated masks, their peepholes black spots of indifference surmounting pinched and impenetrable mouths. Colour hovers expressively over limb and cheek, exceeding any naturalistic remit and refusing both humanist insight and ideological instrumentalization in the replaying of the photographic mise-en-scène. Applied in sweeping strokes and fluid, terps-laden gestures, the paint plays with shadow and shape in a haptic display of mark-making that rejects the smooth-over surface of the very image that gave it its form. At the same time, though, the chromatic coherence of the painting reinforces the sense that the group breathes and lives as one body, symmetrically glued to seat and spot around the authoritative core of the teacher. Now, the generic nature of Dumas' source is, I think, instructive. For one, it allows us to delve into our own pictorial archives, substituting and supplementing personal images for the one that prompted her exuberant painting. At the same time, it alerts us to the way that photographic protocols now inform ways of seeing and appearing, irrespective of the individual instance portrayed. For Dumas paints under the sign and the sway of the photographic, that overtly as well as subliminally provides the language through which her paintings are framed. All of Dumas' paintings negotiate the photographic and worked from photographs. But it's a specific time-bound activity and performance that the teacher sub-A seems to encode, evoking as it does a childhood of the mid-20th century. Shown here are the children of the analog age, used to turning our best faces to the camera and holding our frozen gazes for a while. Being photographed for us as school pupils was an elaborate, serious performance that took time and money and commitment. We were told to dress neatly, tie our hair in bunches, and be sure to polish our shoes for the one day in the year when the photographer came to school. He would not come again for another 12 months, and the precious memento of our belonging was neither cheap nor easy to reproduce. It was not a day to miss. It was not a time to misbehave. It is this historical specificity of the visual culture of a colonial childhood that Dumas' incendiary chromatics point out. This is Sub-A, the first class of primary school, through which 6-year-olds once entered into the segregated classrooms of Christian national education, to be taught basic skills alongside conformity and knowing one's place. For this, they would be rewarded and praised. But as an adult and an artist, Dumas refuses to colour within the lines or neatly shade the figures with the designated flesh tones of authority. Neatness and obedience are staged in the structure and repetitive poses of the underlying image, only to be troubled through gesture, palette, and paintwork, so that the once taken image and the once black and white childhood is remade and remodeled afresh. Now, for Dumas, painting offers a space for the disruption of norms that are photographically implotted and endorsed. Like many of the painters of her generation, the world is approached tangentially via the media-saturated image bank that surrounds her. For her, there is no such thing as an unmediated experience or authentic encounter with a lived or code-free corporeality. Post-conceptual painting takes its knowing place in the wake of the ubiquity of the photographic image, not through recourse to a pre-industrial celebration of the eye or a faith in the proximity or tangibility of bodies, but rather by confronting the mechanics of the photographic as the ground both of painting's criticality and of its contemporaneity. Zooming in and zooming out of a scenario, closing in on a detail, enlarging and fragmenting at will, the language of photography permeates her compositional strategies, providing a vocabulary for framing or plotting a scene. At the same time, the attitude to a source photograph is, as we've seen, far from deferential. If anything, it is accosted and challenged, cropped and cut by a gestural and painterly dynamic that overwrites or defaces its history-laden form with a defiance that comes from the hand. And yet, photographs, collected, scavenged, reproduced, and rescaled, form the basis of Dumas' access to the real, whether sourced from her own family album, as in this instance, or from the image banks that circulate in the world. Reproducing and adapting them is at once a political act and an aesthetic gesture. In fact, they are inseparable as such. Now, The Widow, like The Teacher sub A, is a reworked photograph. But where the class portrait deals with the cliched and the generic, the formulaic and the conventional, The Widow invokes an enigmatic, unique pictorial precedent that is more difficult and complex to unravel. Cut off at the edges, capturing a crowd that is as much suggested as seen, The Widow speaks to the technologies of modern history as captured and conveyed in the newsworthy snapshot or print. The source photograph we intimate beyond the painterly touches and the fragmentary composition reads less as the product of ritualized display than as casual reportage, relaying its assortment of ill-defined figures for a future that has not yet been imagined or prepared. Its iconic power is retrospective rather than prefigured or planned. At face value, The Widow portrays a scene in which a bare-breasted African woman is escorted in a vaguely glimpsed crowd by a pair of her bleached-out compatriots, dressed in casual open-necked shirts, cotton shorts, and socks or solemn ink-black slacks. The antinomies of clothing and nakedness, European costume and African flesh, masculinity and femininity are encapsulated in this unlikely threesome. And the painting seems to zoom in on the central group, cutting off their shoes and feet, as well as the blurred surrounding figures, as if extracting a still from a movie strip or an expanded contextualizing drama. This is not a generic or typical scene. It's clearly based on a specific event, and the almost life-size figures come towards us as if emerging or advancing from history. In fact, the context for the triumvirate is more fully filled out in a small companion painting. It's smaller, paradoxically significantly smaller in scale than The Widow, but including much more of the setting. Here, the same central group is seen, this time in situ, flanked on the left by a couple of pale-skinned male figures dressed alternately in army uniform and lounge suit, while the motley crowd behind them and to the right is sketched in to amplify the larger context from which they appear to proceed. From the oil painting alone, it's clear that the image derives from a reproduced source, depicting a specific public procession played out in an urban environment. The photographic origin of the works is apparent, not only by the cut-off composition and frontal orientation of the scene, in which the figures seem to walk towards us as if into the lens of a camera, but by the essentially tonal arrangement of the shapes. The two works from 2013 are directly related to an earlier gigantic collage entitled Drie Vrouwen en Ek, Three Women and I, from 1982. Separated by just over 30 years, the widow relates back, therefore, both to a source photograph and to an earlier iteration of its use. In the earlier collage, a close-up and severely cropped rendition of the central group of figures is mounted on card between two other blown-up drawings of solitary or widowed women. The one, Malcolm X's grieving wife, Betty, shown at the bottom. The other one, Winnie Mandela, wife of Nelson, who was then incarcerated and on trial for treason, shown at the top. All of the drawings reproduce details of iconic historical photographs. Extracted from the news and reworked in multiple media, the famous images are enlarged and framed so as to both point to and exceed their historical roles as documents, while enshrining their protagonists as heroines. The middle drawing is the one to which Dumas returned after 30 years or more. It reproduces part of the iconic photograph of the flanked Madame Pauline Lumumba, widow of the assassinated Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Congo, who was brutally killed in mysterious circumstances in 1961. What unites the three women is their relationship to famous black politicians and the spousal solitariness that their husbands' fates produced. Beneath the triumvirate of actual or grass widows, Dumas placed herself as a simplified, cartoon-like mask mounted on a wooden block, as if occupying the space of the viewer or witness who pulls the evidentiary materials of the past into what appears as a giant, fantastical film strip or a vertical triptych. Three Women and I, Dumas calls it, implicating herself in the scenarios her crayon revisits, her self-emplotment both in the title and in the totem, literalizing her attachment to her female protagonists as characters through which to think her relation to history and the images via which it is learned. The pictorial past is veiled in blues and purples. It is scratched and hatched, shaded and hacked, stretched and magnified. But the underlying press photographs from which the enlarged portraits are made remain assertively, undeniably present. Now, two of the drawings from the giant collage are based on reproductions that appeared together in a book published in 1976 entitled Assassination in Our Time, comprising a kind of album with images and texts chronicling 20 assassinations of famous men of the 20th century. The reproduced agents of history, they are survived by their long-suffering widows, including Betty Shabazz having a microphone shoved in her face after identifying her husband's body at the morgue, and Pauline Lumumba, stripped bare to the waist on a procession in Leopoldville after the murder of her husband, Patrice. So it was in this book that Dumas, then resident in Amsterdam, encountered the reproduced photograph of Pauline Lumumba for the first time. And she was struck, as she has said, by what she saw as the spectacle of, I quote, the bare-breasted woman in mourning for her husband. It was the caption that accompanied the reproduced image which directed her to read the picture in this way. Madame Lumumba is bare-breasted as a sign of mourning, asserts the text, interpreting the significance of the costume in a way that had the effect of both depoliticizing the widow's gesture and naturalizing the figure in relation to the iconic image of African femininity still operative in ethnographic and racialized discourse of the time. The trope of the semi-naked mourning widow characterized much of the covering of the event in the West, with newspapers from the Sydney Morning Herald to Time magazine focusing on culturally specific rituals of grieving as an explanation of Madame Lumumba's comportment and dress. But of course, it's important to remember that the photographic depiction of bare-breasted African women, however solitary or incongruous or vulnerably exposed, was neither anomalous nor unexpected at the time. In fact, it could be easily accommodated through recourse to so-called traditional mores, as well as conventions of representation and depiction. Any number of bare-breasted depictions of black women still circulated in Europe at the time. But in these cases, the figures are invariably situated in nature, in a state of assumed authentic and unreflective simplicity. But the image of a semi-naked woman in an urban environment, juxtaposed with her clothed and westernized countrymen, made her sartorial gesture noteworthy and incongruous. It was something that needed to be explained and explored, whether by returning her to nature from which she had strayed, or by explaining her gesture in anthropological or ethnographic terms. The contextualized portrayal of the bereaved Madame Lumumba did not signal the first time that the photograph had entered into Marlene Dumas' consciousness. In fact, Dumas had come upon a reference to this very image in the third volume of Simone de Beauvoir's autobiography, Force of Circumstance, while she was still an art student in Cape Town. And it was this particular fingered and dog-eared edition of Force of Circumstance. This is my own copy. We were both reading these things in the 70s in South Africa, as many young women were. So it was this particular fingered and dog-eared edition, published in French in 1963 and in translation by Penguin in 1968, with Giacometti's famous Annette on the cover, which first alerted Dumas to the issue of Madame Lumumba's appearance, as well as to the potential power of its famous photographic recording. Turning back recently in Amsterdam to her annotated volume of de Beauvoir's memoir, Dumas discovered that she had, as a student, underlined a few sentences in the book that dealt with the very picture to which she was drawn. She had not yet been exposed to the actual image. She hadn't seen the photograph, but the words must have seemed significant and true. NB, she had scrawled in thick black lines in the margin, while her broken line traced a hesitant path beneath the poignant and prescient lines. I quote, "The assassination of Lumumba, the photographs of his wife leading his mourners, head shaved, breast bared. What novel could compete with that?" So had de Beauvoir rhetorically asked, in response to a comment made by her friend, the working-class feminist writer Christiane Rochefort, who had stopped writing fiction for a while. "I can't get interested in my piddling little stories. Not at the moment, she had declaimed. Now, there was much in these lines to intrigue Dumas, the art student and aspirant painter. At the level of the pictorial, the evocation of the bare-breasted, cropped-haired African widow leading a procession of mourners must have set off a visual trigger or conjured an intriguing image of a forbidden yet fascinating world. For one thing, Africa as a continent was a physical no-go zone for most South Africans during apartheid. Instead, it served as an imaginary, ill-defined dark mass in the censored and circumscribed lives that we led. Lumumba's assassination, which de Beauvoir, following the Soviet line, goes on to describe as a stain on the good name of America and the United Nations, Belgium and the entire Western world. And Lumumba's immediate circle of followers was little reported or discussed in the environment we inhabited down south. But something must have struck the young Dumas in the few sentences that she picked out from the page, and they would still reverberate decades later in her work. But just as significant as the underlined passage, but just as significant in the underlined passage as the visualization of the semi-naked widow was the burning question of the opposing claims of literature and photography in the recounting of and accounting for history. What novel could compete with that, asked de Beauvoir rhetorically of the photograph that created the stir? Could literature ever encapsulate the drama and spectacular impact of photography? And where, Dumas might have added, would painting lie between the narrative propulsion of fiction and the documentary directive and immediacy of the newsworthy snapshot or image? Could painting ever be adequate to the dramatic impact and archival import of the photograph with its proximity to history, its quotidian density, and apparent veridical truth? For a politically aware South African at the time that Dumas was reading her de Beauvoir, documentary photography was unassailable as the conduit of a conscience-driven practice. Projects like David Goldblatt's On the Mines, published in 1973, and a copy of which Dumas owned at the time, set the gold standard for a form of evidentiary social realism that stood for a revolutionary aesthetics tied to the verifiable events of the day. Subject to censorship and often taken at great risk, the black and white photograph came to represent a hard-won record of an increasingly dangerous real. But what could the language of painting have to say to the affairs and effects of the world? How, as Edouard Manet might have asked, could painting be of its time? How could it avoid the vulgar literary or merely descriptive and still remain both relevant and rooted in the present? For Dumas, it's in the ambivalent and complex relationship to the photographic that this is played out and repeatedly explored. If Christiane Rochefort intuited that photography trumped the novel in its capacity to transcend piddling little stories, then for Dumas, like many painters of her generation, it remains the technology that still has to be both addressed and overcome. Placed between the competing spectres of narrative overkill and literal verisimilitude, painting is required to assert its own relatively autonomous voice. Now, this was already arguably the case for Manet, whose multiple versions of the execution of Maximilian were amongst the earliest oil paintings to be conceived via newspaper reportage and an awareness of circulating photographs. Alongside Manet's well-known sources such as Goya and Velázquez and Courbet, therefore, stood the modest carte de visite or albumen print that provided new visual models for contemporary newsworthy events. So modernist painting, from Manet to Dumas, remains critically engaged, therefore, with the force of photography's veridical hold, at the same time as it troubles and unsettles its putative claims on the truth. What happens when the source image is itself so powerful and generative that it threatens both to destabilize the novel and to upstage its painterly progeny is a question we may need to address. Now, the memorable photograph that underpins the paintings of the widow has itself got a riveting story to tell. As I said, it was first seen by Dumas in 1976 in the volume on assassination in our time. And in this volume, it takes its place in a section on the murdered Lumumba, alongside copiously illustrated essays on the lives and deaths of famous men. But the picture also, as we've seen, invokes the subgenre of widow portraits, ranging from a veiled Jacqueline Kennedy to a headscarfed Betty Shabazz and a lamenting Pamela Mboya, all representing the public display of bereaved wives, the feminine counterparts to the heroic men who remain the principal subjects of history and publishing. Now, in relation to all of these, the image of Madame Lumumba stands out. For while similarly flanked and framed by public figures or family members who apparently share her grief, Madame Lumumba's performance of self seems to separate her from her surrounding supporters. Rather than veiled or covered or weeping, as the iconic role of the widow demands, Madame Lumumba appears to bare her body boldly, expose her flesh, and produce a corporeal gesture that deliberately confounds expectation and flouts European rules of dress and decorum. For Dumas, concerned as she has been with icons of the feminine, Pauline Lumumba became the embodiment of the African widow, a counterpoint to the much reproduced figure of Jacqueline Kennedy, who came to serve as the quintessential American widow, immortalized via canonical photographs and their reworking through Andy Warhol's famous prints. For Dumas, the figuration of African femininity in this way provides a counterpoint to the homogeneity and hegemony of Western pictorial prototypes. In the 1976 volume, the slightly cropped photograph was reproduced on a double-page spread, alongside images of Lumumba's son playing with a toy pistol the day before he learned of his father's death, and a photograph shot 6 months after the assassination of Lumumba's successors, thought at the time to be responsible for his death. So the overarching context of the double-page spread is masculine and military, exacerbating the anomalous appearance of the unclad woman on the right. And as we've seen, the photograph itself was accompanied by a lengthy caption, which indicates that she's the widow of the slain premier, that she's bare-breasted, and that this is a sign of mourning, and also includes the fact that she sought to have a Christian burial for her husband, but to no avail. The implications of the placement of the photograph and the caption are clear. The African widow reverts to the local custom of baring her breasts to express her sorrow in a man's and militarized world. The photograph appears to isolate and underline Madame Lumumba's gesture, but the caption also reassures that it does not undermine the Christian faith of a believer whose tragedy is magnified by the fact that she's unable to bury her husband's remains. This powerful image of a bereft figure, vulnerable and exposed in public, served to define and delimit Pauline Lumumba's gesture in her time. For Dumas, in 1982, its significance and resonance would be framed in the early collage by different models of black feminine fortitude. But Dumas would confront this image source formally again only in 2013, when an invitation to show alongside the Belgian artist Luc Tuymans prompted her to recall and revisit this episode. Dumas has often been compared to Tuymans, and their work has been shown together since the early 1990s, especially because of the fact that both work from recycled photographs, in particular ones drawn from the press. And for this joint exhibition, twice in 2013, both artists dealt with Belgium's colonial history. But Tuymans, Dumas noticed, had, in an earlier handling of the theme for the Venice Biennale of 2001, entirely omitted women from his painterly panoply, concentrating instead on figures like the Belgian king Baudouin in Moana Kitoko and the iconic spectacled Patrice Lumumba in Lumumba. This was a version of history in which women were entirely invisible. And it was this that prompted her to return to the earlier image of Pauline Lumumba and the assassination book from which it was drawn. And she produced the first of her two paintings on the theme of the widow. But while she was undertaking further research on the painting, she was able to trace an earlier iteration in an expanded print that had appeared in Time magazine barely a month after Lumumba was killed. You can see, for example, that you can see the feet, you can see more of the figures on the side. The image on the top is the one from the book on the assassination. The image on the bottom is the one that she finds in Time magazine. And it's only after she's seen the Time magazine version that Dumas executes her small second painting, also entitled The Widow. Smaller in scale, as I've said, but expanded in view. It's as if Dumas' delight in the discovery of the contemporary document led to her reproducing the picture intact at the same time as she more closely approximated its modest scale, shrinking from the zoomed-in enlargement of the close-up to create a more faithful reproduction of an actual photograph than she habitually allows herself to make. Now, the initial photograph, it turned out, had been taken by a Dutchman, Ed van Kaan, who had sold it in 1961 to the United Press International. And it appeared in Time magazine in the context of an article on the American response to the news of Lumumba's death and the Cold War fallout around it. The cover for Time for February 1961 showed the Soviet delegate, Valerian Zoran, addressing the United Nations in the aftermath of Lumumba's assassination, an event that had precipitated protests across the world. The Soviets, claimed Time, had jumped on the anti-colonial bandwagon to accuse the United States of supporting the Belgians and the Secretary-General of the United Nations of being an imperialist lackey and an accomplice and organizer of murder. And the picture on the cover shows Zoran laying out the Soviets' demands for retribution against the perpetrators of the murder and the withdrawal of Belgian and United Nations troops from the Congo. The article chronicles the competing claims for Lumumba's succession and the miserable scramble for power that ensued. But amongst the political analysis and the pictures of rioters and picketers from Cairo to Paris and Brussels appeared the photograph of Madame Lumumba, accompanied with the caption, Lumumba's mourning, widow in Leopoldville, gone with the Paris frocks. In the pages of Time magazine, the image appeared startling and strong. What novel, we may wonder, following de Beauvoir, could compete with an image like this? And she probably saw it in Time magazine, of course. And what painting could successfully adopt or adapt it? In the photograph, Madame Lumumba's difference is encoded in black and white, not only through the technologies of print, but in the dramatic juxtaposition of her dark, naked flesh against the crisp white clothing of her Congolese male companions. It separates the widow, establishing a solitary and isolated position for her gesture, while the caption underlines its volitional character by invoking the image of her more habitual attire, the Paris frocks, by which she was more usually known. Nakedness here is construed as a renunciation of the costume of French femininity. Mourning is produced as an eschewal, a stripping away of the trappings of metropolitan chic. Now, the accompanying article goes further in this direction than the caption. At the height of her husband's power, 28-year-old Pauline Lumumba wore diamonds and high heels and Paris frocks. Last week, she bared her breasts in the Congo's traditional sign of mourning and led a wailing procession of other bare-breasted women through the streets of Leopoldville, it records. For this commentator, the baring of breasts and a shawl of frocks, the collective wailing and processing in public, represents a deviation from the customary comportment of the figure. It is worthy of note. It must be explained and excused. But above all, it's a manifestation of a culturally specific and African expression of grief, explained here for the benefit of Times international readership. Now, a family portrait of the Lumumbas with their children, taken shortly before Patrice's death, provides an interesting contrast with the famous image of the bare-breasted widow. Madame Lumumba is here shown as the epitome of the westernized wife, surrounded by her neatly dressed offspring. Lumumba himself is characteristically dapper in well-cut suit and spectacles. Typical of many family photographs from the 1950s, the group is carefully posed, their feet making a smooth diagonal across the well-clipped lawn. Madame Lumumba takes up her demure position like a suburban matriarch, her sandaled feet, smoothed hair, and feathered hat looking the picture of 50s respectability, the perfect wife, the fecund mother, the docile partner. This is what the picture gives off. Why then did Madame Lumumba choose to appear publicly in the manner of the Time magazine photograph? The repeated assertion of her grief and the rituals of African modes of mourning may be one thing, providing a suitably comforting explanatory filter for the readers of Time magazine. Recourse to indigenous ritual and a reversion to a so-called primitive authenticity is not in itself a controversial or challenging stance. In fact, the sight of Madame Lumumba in cloth sarong and little else might have reassured some Western observers for whom the Paris frocks would have represented a thin and unconvincing veneer. For them, Madame Lumumba could be seen to have reverted to type. Beneath the dresses and pearls lurked a primitive and atavistic subjectivity that was only temporarily and unconvincingly obscured. What jarred in this photograph, therefore, was not primarily the spectacle of Pauline's flesh, but its positioning alongside the crisp white safari suit and open-necked shirt of her minders, so that the trio appears anomalous and odd. Discordant, too, with the primitive or pastoral disrobing are the nearby guns and suits of the European attendants and guards, and the heated crowd of followers looking on from nearby. There is danger and tension in the scene. In this context, the diminutive Madame Lumumba's nakedness has power. It undercuts the fragile consensus that surrounds her. It is spectacularly, even explosively other, condensing in its iconic complexity infinitely more than piddling narrative could convey, or so Simone de Beauvoir had implied at the time, and Dumas had acknowledged through her inky endorsement and emphasis long before she transformed it in paint. Now, Dumas' insistent return to this distillation or figuration of difference gives us pause. Extracted from the contexts of magazine or book, enlarged and adapted in crayon or paint, Madame Lumumba's startling sartorial statement seems provocative and glaringly brave. It's tempting to subsume her pictorial mode of dress into a history of Western painting, in which allegorical figurations of femininity is repeatedly and unflinchingly invoked through the abstraction and display of female flesh. But I don't think that's the right way to go, for Dumas' works are anything but. Perhaps this is because already embedded in the source photograph is a tension and disturbing unease that is not easily abstracted or rendered either emblematic or allegorical. For one thing, the aesthetic of the press photo, grainy, minuscule, carelessly composed and close-up, denudes the figures of any lofty or literary significance. Here we are invited to view the picture of an actual newsworthy event, photographed in a recognizable place. It is the spectacle of the moment, not the underlying narrative or moralizing lesson that confronts us. The nakedness of the principal protagonist feels real and provocative rather than didactic or distant or symbolic. There's something brutal and visceral being enacted here. The bare feet on the pavement seem to announce this, as does the casual presence of soldiers and guns, not to mention the uniforms and masculine parade that surrounds the small central female figure. Her downward glance, defensive placement of the arm across the midriff, and purposeful step appears self-contained and isolated, as if undertaken alone with volition and will. In the context of the street and the crowd, the bared chest and feet suggest an insubordinate act in which grief is overlaid with defiance and mourning comes laced with anger. Alone in her chosen attire, the widow seems to stride through the city, solitary but assured in her action, aware of the scandal that her appearance provokes. All eyes are upon her, heads turn, bodies veer towards her. Our attention, like theirs, is fixed. But of course, Madame Lumumba's gesture was neither an anomalous nor unprecedented act, nor can it simply be subsumed into an innocent reversion to type, a recourse to cultural authenticity in the face of understandable grief. The use of bare-breasted display could be strategic, and its use as a form of female protest goes back a long way in African culture. African women have frequently and famously demonstrated their rage by confronting their enemies stripped bare. Strategic stripping was a particularly powerful tool in the context of anti-colonial struggle. And in 1929, women in eastern Nigeria famously marched en masse against colonial authority and racialized Western notions of the female body. In 1960, the year before Lumumba's assassination, Julia Chikamoneka, the Zambian activist and liberation leader, used the visit of the Secretary of State for the Colonies as an occasion to march naked alongside other women in protest against colonial rule and to call for immediate independence. In the view of Chikamoneka and her fellow strippers, to show nakedness was the most powerful way to demonstrate anger, and the only weapon they had with which to highlight the suffering of their people. In the Congo, like many other African countries, naked female protest has been widely used and understood, whether for political or personal reasons. So there's no doubt that Pauline Lumumba understood the impact and potential effects of her action. She lived in a world in which varying costumes could be adopted and removed, strategically deployed and denounced. It's safe to assert, therefore, that she was neither naively reverting to authentic attire in the company of her traditional sisters, nor merely expressing her private sorrow when she took bare-breasted to the streets of Leopoldville in January 1961. The whole issue of dress for African women in Madame Lumumba's position was in any case fraught and contested. Though she came from a small village and was raised in a rural home, her daily dress as Lumumba's wife was, as we have seen, conspicuously and fashionably European. In keeping with the évolué context in which Lumumba wished to be seen, The ruling male elites in the newly liberated Congo were fluent in French language and fashion and saw themselves as participants in a cosmopolitan cultural milieu that was not incompatible with their anti-colonial politics. Lumumba himself identified as a so-called évolué. This was the word used at the time to designate an educated African man who had taken on the language, clothing, and manners of the colonizers. And Lumumba advocated girls' education and criticized arranged marriages, the custom of bride wealth, and what he saw as outdated and obsolete traditional practices, instead enshrining the husband as the benevolent patriarchal center of an enlightened nuclear family with an obedient but respected and well-schooled wife at its heart. He was a fierce critic of the ignorance in which colonial schooling had kept women and of the concomitant cultural separation of husbands and wives. Now, to be awarded the status of an évolué is a complicated business. The aspirant had to be examined in his home by the Belgian authorities in order to prove that he was civilized and worthy of the title. And in this context, his wife's behavior reflected on him and needed to be carefully controlled. Pauline's relationship to this tyrannical regime was complicated and not without conflict. Her appearance in particular was the subject of marital tension. She recorded how Lumumba insisted that she hid herself in the bedroom until he had inspected her attire so that she was suitably dressed to receive his friends. Her inability to speak French was an embarrassment to her husband, and she rarely accompanied him on official functions or platforms. On the occasion of his inauguration and the delivery of his legendary speech, in which he refused to accept the role of Leopold's lackey, she was absent, apparently, legend has it, because her hair was a mess. But Madame Lumumba didn't inhabit her required role without dissent. Shortly before independence, on 30th of June 1960, she and some other wives of évolué men organized a protest against their husbands. The women were concerned that the men would be tempted to marry better educated, more Europeanized women, able to take part in diplomatic events. They argued that women who had fought for independence should be elevated and honored, irrespective of how they were regarded by European hierarchies and values. So Pauline's relationship to Belgian customs and costume was at best ambivalent, at worst hostile. She knew very well how to wear her Paris frocks and high heels, but she also chose when and why to remove them. So Madame Lumumba's self-performance in the funeral procession is thus overdetermined and complex to read. That she knew what it was to mobilize traditional somatic and sartorial signifiers in order to make a statement is undeniable, even if she was unable to read or write. Interpreting her act respectfully as a gesture of mourning or patronizingly as an abdication of a civilized veneer provides a very limited view. Another possibility is that Madame Lumumba may have been staging her own and her fellow countrywomen's protest, both at the Belgian occupiers and at the predicament in which their own husbands had placed them. Not only had they been rendered inferior by the colonial establishment, but their very own compatriots had found them wanting in civilization and culture. Now that Lumumba was no longer there to inspect her costume, look over her hairstyle, and sanction her imported appearance, Pauline Lumumba was free to undertake the role of the grieving African widow, barefoot, bareheaded, and bare-breasted. It's questionable whether her husband would have approved. 4, her gesture potentially reads as an act of protest, not only against her husband's assassins and their many high-placed international accomplices, but against the invidious position in which she, as an African wife, had been placed. The possibility of this kind of dissent has been whitewashed from post-colonial history. Madame Lumumba herself has rewritten the past so that she's positioned as the grieving widow of her unblemished and lionized husband. And Patrice Lumumba has taken his rightful place as one of Africa's great liberatory martyrs, one of the greatest and one of the great orators as well, the hero of images and texts, from the hagiographic celebration of Aimé Césaire's 1966 drama to Samuel Foss's recent impersonation of the assassinated leader amongst a panoply of African heroes. I'm not contesting Lumumba's place, just talking about the way in which history doesn't allow us to see the complexity of the situation in which this kind of heroic action is played out. Where this places women's history and the ongoing exclusion of female agency from the stories of Africa's past is at least opened to question by Dumas' monumentalizing and transforming of an icon once thought to be readily and easily decoded. When de Beauvoir discussed this extraordinary photograph at the time of its first publication, she ascribed it with a power that she felt surpassed that of fiction. Condensed in the juxtaposition of the semi-naked widow and her minders, among the soldiers and spectators turned towards them, was a powerful, iconic message that she felt words were inadequate to describe. Dumas' response to the photograph has been to rework it 3 times, alternately zooming in on the widow and her minders and spreading out to accommodate the crowd. In the earliest iteration, it was the stoicism and fortitude of individual black women that the work seemed to declare and proclaim, and in relation to which the artist placed her implicated self. In the last, the little one, it was the wider context of setting and crowd that was sketched in like an impressionist cityscape in which the main trio is seen matter-of-factly to proceed. There's neither the squashed-in concentration nor atmospheric expansiveness in the second. Instead, an intense drama seems to be played out amongst the threesome against a sketchy and indeterminate crowd. We can barely identify the liquefied white man who flanks our 3 figures on the left. Alongside him, a man's face has become a watery mask. The spectacled chap behind Madame Lumumba appears as little but a hazy blur. And the faceless figure on the right is a smudge and an accent in paint rather than an individual who draws us away. Dissolution and exposure, the very tools of analog photography's recourse to liquid and light, seem thematized in Dumas' use of paint. But compositionally, all attention is focused on the central threesome, in whose touching bodies and compact presence attention and anxiety unfolds. Much of this is to do, I think, with the staging of race and gender, a split that is posited at the heart of this painting, in a way that the colour-coated homogeneity of the teacher just couldn't and wouldn't allow. Let us look first at the issue of complexion, where intensified chromatics in the teacher made a mockery of the shared attributes of whiteness, opening up the component pigments of flesh tones to reveal the colours that go into the designated category white. The depleted palette and tonality of the widow leaves a doubt at the heart of the image. It reads as an exercise in successive shades of blackness and whiteness, whether photographically or ontologically understood, despite the odd bits of colour washed in. Pauline's head and neck are placed in dark and deliberate shadow, and her arms and upper body are drawn in a heavy black series of strokes so that her blackness is literalized and appears fixed definitively and firmly on her body. In contrast, her accompanying minders in their Western attire seem pale and light-skinned in comparison, either overexposed or bleached, at least as far as heads and upper limbs are concerned. Even the bare legs of the man on the left seem to echo the black silhouette of his companion's trousers, rather than register the patina or texture of skin. Flanking the figure of the dark-skinned widow, therefore, are a pair of whitened men with Congolese features, whose costume and complexion seem to separate them from her provocative mode of address. The effect of the painting, then, whether intentional or not, is to point to a gendered split that is played out at the level of race. Perhaps this serves inadvertently to highlight the disjunction between the way that men and women lived out the processes and effects of anti-colonialism. For while the évolué elites negotiated their politics of liberation in French and in open-necked shirts and lounge suits, many of their wives struck an uneasy balance between aspirant European identification and an attachment to local customs and rituals. By homing in on the group and taking liberties with the facts of the photograph, Dumas unearths a latent meaning that it registers but does not declare. Of course, the complex dynamic of men and women, clothed in flesh, dark and light, was already encapsulated in the newspaper image. But in the process of transcription, enlargement, and repetition, Dumas heightens and enhances a difference that she discerns to be embedded at its core. In this context, the pale figures of attendant colonial officials and soldiers are irrelevant, reduced to a liquefied caricature on the left and excised from the scene. Instead, it's an internal drama that the performance of the widow plays out. Faced with an actual photograph, one as loaded and powerful as this one, what is left for the painter to do? It's not as if she's retelling her own story through the gesture of an African woman. When faced with the stereotypical photo of her own girlhood, she triumphed over the banal and predictable document by troubling the chromatics of race and unfixing the generic and stilted uniformity of the colonial classroom. But when encountering a powerful document of history, not once or twice, but 3 times, she could neither reproduce it unscathed nor fail to trouble its habitual underpinnings. It's true that the photograph of Pauline Lumumba, unlike that of the generic school class, is overwhelmingly powerful and poignant. It's one of those photographs that puts into question what we think we know and understand of the world. So riveting was it to its earliest viewers that it led Simone de Beauvoir to doubt the effectiveness or place of the novel. This may be true at times for the painter too, who must find her way amongst the plethora of imagery that surrounds us in order to question what it is that paint does. Oops. At the least, we may argue, paint seizes and sifts from the maelstrom, rendering visible what was repressed from view and reforming the known and the felt through estranging and remaking the found. This is easily done with the banal residues and knickknacks of the album. Colour and scale, brushwork and touch serve to unsettle the familiar documents we hold dear and give form to an affective link to the past. Out of the trivia of personal memory, a new monumentality is forged. But when the referent is so overtly burdened with history, so powerful and iconic in itself, it's harder to decipher what painting, recontextualizing, and repeating it achieves. Perhaps it's always at the level of latency that the work of the painter as archivist is found. It's this question, I think, that Dumas' recourse to photography lays bare. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamar. And we are going to have a little time for questions. And not only was that incredibly eloquent, but that last point about what it is that painting has got to do, I think might have provoked a few questions in people's minds. Can we wait for a mic to arrive? This is an auditorium in which we're going to need to use a mic to capture questions.
Thank you, Tamar. With that image, the sense that it's a strategic act of defiance on behalf of Lumumba seems to me quite clear, and also one maybe where she's aware that she's in the eye of the media. But there's something also about the image, whether it's the point of the artist or not, that reminds me very much of this idea of the sort of head-shaved, shamed, paraded woman through the streets that we see in popular culture, we know is quite a powerful kind of image, the fallen woman, the whore, the witch kind of thing. So there's this unusual tension. Do you pick that up, or am I wrong there? Or
interestingly, the next chapter in this project is a chapter I've just written about the tondue, the shaved women in France, funnily enough, it's a chapter which is about the South African photographer Constance Stewart, later known as Constance Stewart Larrabee, who was embedded with the South African forces in the Second World War and went with the Americans to the liberation of France, and there witnessed these extraordinary painful scenes of the women who'd been shamed and shaved in the streets of Paris. So I've been thinking a lot about shaved heads and writing about them. But I actually don't think that that is really a cultural referent here, because I think that is so culturally specific to the way in which European hair is conceived as a sign of the feminine, and long hair and, coiffed hair, etc., within European culture. But I think that African women's hair has a whole different history and dynamic, and the shaving of hair and the plaiting of hair and the using of hair, I mean, there's a huge, huge politics and history of, as I'm sure you know, of African hair. So I don't read her short hair here necessarily as a gesture in that way. Although what's interesting, now that I think about it, is if we go back and look at some of the images of when she's dressed in her Paris frocks, she's got a sort of headdress, hasn't she, on the one, I don't know if you can see it now. Just quickly put it down. She's got a sort of, she's got a kind of little, what do you call those little feathery headpieces? It's not quite a hat, but it's a sort of, there's a word for it. Women who go to Ascot wear things like that. So it's not a full hat, it's a little headpiece. And there she is absolutely styling her hair, isn't she, and straightening her hair. Whereas the other image of the hair is has got a sort of afro look. So, you might be onto something there. I hadn't thought of it in those terms because we're so used to, can I push on? African women, and you look at the other women at the back of the photographs, etc., at the back of the crowd scene, that sort of, it's before, I think, the whole styling of African hair in the way that we think of it now, but, forms of plaiting and extensions and whatever that has become so much part of African style. But there nevertheless were all sorts of different ways of wearing hair. I don't know, I just wouldn't want to necessarily conflate that, but I'd be open to hearing an argument that might want to take it that way. Yeah. It is true that the head looks naked compared to those other two images. So as I'm thinking aloud and looking at it, I'm getting more open to it. But I don't know what I'd do with that. Thank you. It's interesting.
Can I get you to say more about what you were saying at the end about painting's sort of role, or what painting is there to do, if anything? Because that would seem to be, is that point in some way generalizable? Is it a deployment of painting by an activist-oriented mindset, or is it something that you feel sort of inheres in painting?
Well, I think that most, or a lot of the most interesting painting of our time is engaged with the visual archive of modernity and the technologies of modernity, and obviously photography and cinema are at the heart of that. So a lot of the painting that is self-critical and self-exploratory is thinking about what it can do in relation to that whole ubiquity of mechanical reproduction that surrounds us. So you already have a kind of tension in that something about our image world is made explicit, because when you're in the realm of the photographic, you're in that world, it becomes a naturalized language, and also the way in which photographs function as documents, and particularly within the context of newspaper reportage, they become, evidentiary and documentary, and most often when you look at photographs within that context, you're not questioning the rhetorical gestures of the photograph, you're reading the photograph for information. That's how photographs are used within that documentary idiom. We all know that that's all contrived and false, etc. But you already need a certain kind of critical purchase on the language of photography in order to be thinking about how photography constructs meaning. But I think what painting does when it addresses photographs is render visible the sort of generic and the codes of photography and the artifice of the photographic and the claims that photographs make. So by changing scale, by cropping, by doing different things with the photographic, it becomes a kind of critical riff on photography. So that's one thing it's doing. But it also negotiates the very histories that photography implots. And so it invites you to revisit those historical moments and to revisit that pictorial archive, because it draws attention to that as an archive. If you were just looking at this in Time magazine, or even if you were sensitive enough to see that if you got the assassination book that it had been cropped, most people wouldn't even notice that it had been cropped, because we're so numb and used to looking at photographs all the time that we can't see what information they actually possess. And also we're used to photographs appearing with captions. And captions always mediate for us what photographs mean. So, which is why for how many years, for 50 or 60 years, everybody just read this photograph as an image of the mourning widow, because that's what Time magazine said, and who knows what editor put that caption there. And even Dumas read it as that. I mean, she's now read this paper and was completely taken aback by the fact that the image could mean something else. So my argument is not that, I think she intuited something about the photograph. She hadn't done the research, she hadn't, gone and read her Gender Politics in the Congo book or whatever, because she's a painter. But there's something about when you, in large scale, when you change the material, when you crop, when you work with color, that renders the photograph visible, renders a kind of dialogical encounter between the painting and the photograph. And sometimes, as I argue here, and I don't know whether it's true, it's just an intuition in a way, it intuits something latent in the photograph itself. So, for a long time when I looked at the painting and looked at the dynamic of race and gender and the way that it's played out and the strangeness of the way in which these men are kind of whitened out. They're definitely Congolese men, but they're turned into these kind of bleached, figures. To me, that then became something, whether consciously or not, she unleashed in the photograph itself, something that was latent. And the reason that I think it's latent is because once you do the historical research, you begin to see that actually that is what's going on in the photograph when you're reading it in relation to its historical situation. So for me, I wouldn't have noticed anything like that in the photograph without the painting to direct me to reading it like that. But what became very evident in writing the paper is that as I got more and more and more interested in the photograph, it almost, at some point, I thought I can't write about this painting because the photograph is that much more interesting, and I'm getting more and more and more interested in the history of the photograph. But then there's this sort of, you're standing on a precipice as a scholar, as a writer, and you think, well, how am I going to bring this back to the painting? And that takes a lot of time and effort to think about how you're going to bring it back to the painting. But yeah, I mean, painting can create a kind of, also a kind of material density of history. It can create a kind of three-dimensionality. It can make things advance and other things recede in a different way. It can flesh out a picture of history, which is not true in the same way as the photograph isn't true, but it's an interpretation of history. And so, yeah, I think that most of the painting of our time that is critically engaged has been doing that for the last 50 years through thinking the photographic, as I think Manet was already doing in some ways.
As I say, that's back to the that you were...
Yeah, exactly. So from the time that photographs become, available and surrounding us, and the things that mediate the events of the world to us, so painters have been interested and engaged with them. There's somebody at the back.
Thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. I wondered about Dumas. I mean, she is very much the quintessential global artist, but how much does a painting like this, what kind of reception might it have in Africa, and in particular in her own place of birth? Do you know?
No, and it's a very good question. It's never been shown in Africa, And I would love to do this paper in Africa in order to see what the response is. It's true that my information around Chikamoneka, the Zambian activist, and the Nigerian woman came out of a workshop I was engaged in. This was in Maputo. I work on a program that takes place in a different African city every year for artists and curators across Africa. And we work a lot around gender issues and feminist issues because that's what interests a lot of the young artists who come on the program. And I just asked a few of them whether, what bare-breasted images mean, the representation of bare-breasted women. And they came up with all sorts of stories about their grandmothers who had been involved in this kind of protest. And the Chikamoneka reference came from one of the Zambian women who was actually on this program. So it's a history that's known in Africa, and it's known as experience as well as known in a kind of more scholarly way. But I would be very interested to know how they would view Dumas' utilization of that image source in this way. And I think that the responses would be multiple. There would be very, very different responses depending on who you were talking with. I think that because Lumumba is such a hero, and he's one of the great liberatory figures of Africa, there's a huge impetus not to sully his memory. And so I think that anything that complicates the relationship between the colonial African leader and his relationship with his wife or wives or women is problematic. I mean, Lumumba was a notorious womanizer, and the sexual politics of that are interesting. There was recently a replaying of the Aimé Césaire kind of play, musical thing in London of Lumumba and all his carrying on, etc. But this is whitewashed out of much of the history of the great African leader. And there's still huge, huge amounts of work to be done to rethink African history through inscribing female agency, and which is part of what I think this project's about. And I think that's at the heart of Dumas' project. I have all sorts of ambivalence about a lot of her work, especially the way in which she appropriates the pornographic, which is one of her other strategies, to use pornographic literature. She does it in the name of a feminist project. I've always found this much more difficult to deal with, and in fact, I never wanted to write on Dumas, except for the fact that I always, for obvious personal reasons, loved that Sub-A picture from the first time I saw it in the 1980s. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience totally identified with it. That was my classroom. That was my teacher. It was so much part of our lives. But for the rest of it, I wasn't particularly convinced by the kind of critical edge in the work, particularly in relation to her feminist politics. But when I saw this painting at the Tate show a couple of years ago, it just blew my mind and completely opened up the possibility of thinking about this. So that's a long answer to your question, but I would want to say that there would probably be multiple complex and different responses, depending on whether you need to keep Lumumba as a totally perfect hero, what your relationship is to African feminisms, which area you come from, which country you come from, your relationship. I mean, it's obviously absolute hatred for the kind of Belgian colonial enslavement, really, of the people of the Congo, from within certain areas of that region. But yeah, I think it's a complex question, and I think there would be multiple responses, but I don't know. There isn't as yet an answer to that, because it's not been shown in Africa, and nobody's written about this painting very much. So there isn't even, there isn't a response to literature. But do you have a sense of what you think the response might be? No.
The global contemporary
is
so much a white construct, and that was the
and of course the global contemporary is like a new country, as if and it often loses the sense of the specificity of the cultural registers to which it refers. But most artists in Africa that I know of, part of the global contemporary. They're not out of the global contemporary. Africa is a modern continent, and been involved working with many, many artists who are as branché and connected with the global contemporary as anyone else. There's no escape from the global contemporary.
But it is great to hear you talking about painting. I mean, because in some ways you have been looking at photography a great deal in the last little while.
Yeah. I'm sort of happy and relieved to be back looking at painting in a funny way. But yes, I am also very engaged with photography. Yeah. And the bigger project of which this is a part looks at the way in which the context of colonialism and the relationship to Southern Africa plays itself out in photographic ways, and the way in which they circulate within a kind of global circuit and exchange. Because I suppose my impetus for that is that, people see sort of Southern Africa, as a kind of, now you work on South Africa. That means you don't work on France anymore. You don't work on, the world anymore. You've kind of become this regional specialist. And of course, there is no such thing, especially when we're in the world of the global contemporary. But there never was, because, travel and migration and the exchange of goods and people goes back from, as we know, many, many hundreds of years. And the way that culture migrates and moves means that these things are always rubbing up against each other. So I'm interested in the way in which photography, particularly, which is invented, during the time of industrialization and modernization in the 19th century, and is quintessentially a medium that moves and migrates and gets to Africa, 10 years after it's invented in Europe, and Africans take photographs and they have a relationship to photography, and it is absolutely part of modernity. So this is the one chapter in which the relationship between painting and photography comes into focus. But there's also a lot of video that I'm being interested in, yeah, because video is very interesting on the continent, yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Might be 20 years before another visit, so you better get your question in now.
Wow. What a thought, yes.
I guess I was
Hi.
intrigued by the first part of the talk when you were reflecting on the school photographs. As you say, we down here in Australia went through that. Kids are still going through that now. And in fact, one of the my stepson features among 1,000 boys on this one enormous photograph. You can see everybody very clearly. And I said to him, how is this possible? And he said, there are 1,000 separate portraits of boys which have been reduced in size and collaged digitally to make this huge school photograph. And there they are. They're all completely recognizable. So there's something about the impulse to make a group portrait that is still very current.
Yeah, but group portraiture, as we know, has existed since the 17th century, since the Dutch started with group portraiture. But of course, they didn't have the technologies of photography. But what I think is very, very interesting in what you say is that digital construction, we may call it photography, and it looks photographic, but it is actually a completely different technology than the photography that we had when we were kids. With that analog process of sitting for the photographer. And yeah, I think there's lots of work done about how the digital changes the way in which we read those images, because, of course, it doesn't presuppose actually people being there. It doesn't presuppose 1,000 people sitting in their serried ranks in a room. It doesn't presuppose the whole apparatus that we think about photography and its relationship to the material and to the real, which is so tied with the analog situation in which photographs are taken, is dispensed with by the digital, because anyone could be there or not be there. Or, history and the present are fabricated on the screen. In some ways, it's more like a painting. People talk about the mouse as like a paintbrush, because you can make anything happen on the screen. Maybe you had to be part of the 1,000, whatever the defining characteristic was, but you didn't have to be there on the day.
No, not on the day. Although form classes, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like
of course.
Specifically groups.
Yeah.
They do stand on the racks, the tallest boys at the back and so forth, down to the front.
Well, you see, that's the way in which technologies mimic previous technologies. There's actually no reason why they need to do that, but they mimic both the form of the previous technology, and they mimic the ritual through which that form is achieved. And it's in the same way as photography mimics painting, or early photography doesn't know how to compose itself except with recourse to painterly precedents. So that you look at a lot of photography in the 19th century, the still life photography and portraiture, for example, and they look like 18th century painted portraits. There's no reason why you have to stand as a man with your hand on a chimney breast or whatever, and or with a book like a scholar at a table or whatever. But these things are very deeply held, naturalized codes within a culture. And so this goes back to your question, Mark, about what painting can do. Because when something is enlarged and distorted and changed, what happens, I think, is that those codes become exposed. So you look at the Sabe, the teacher picture, and it's vast. I mean, it's not, I don't know how, I can never think in feet and inches, but it's probably from the beginning of that screen to about here.
3 meters.
Half the size of the screen, yeah? It's huge. They're life-size. So it completely distorts its image source and makes you think back. You know, when I was looking at things, find my album, can I find that photograph? And then I found it, and of course there's this funny little scruffy deteriorating thing, and I looked on the back, and all our names were written on the back, and it's a completely different material object. It has a completely different history. We have a different affective relationship to it. But you know, when it becomes a painting, it is both referenced and transformed simultaneously. And you could do another project. I'm sure many artists do this because everyone's interested now in archives and photographic and personal archives. So you could re-photograph it, you could digitally manipulate it, you could blow it up, you could collage it, you could do all sorts of things with it. That would lead to a different kind of practice and open up different questions. But the kind of perversity of turning it into a monumental painting, this piece of ephemera, this, you know, funny little incidental, ephemeral, worthless thing except to you for its emotional significance, then becomes a kind of monument of our time. It becomes monumental, and it becomes indicative of a certain moment in history. It tells us how we were, how we behaved, how we looked.
Well, you say we, but within the USA context, I don't know if there's anybody here who can speak to that, but I think of college yearbooks where it's all individualized. Mark, do you know anything about this? Do school kids in the US get group photographs in the same way as we do in the British tradition? Does anybody know? Yes, Stephen. Okay, just the same.
I guess. About the group. And
not to take away from your point, your reading of it as a particularly colonial context photograph of the whitewashing of society through that, but it is not a unique phenomenon to a photographic structure to a colonial environment, and that's unique to America as a colonial environment.
Well, I think those. Yeah, I think that you would have to look to very different cultures, to India, to China, and even they begin to mimic those. I mean, I've had students working on Singaporean photography and Taiwanese photography, etc., and looking at the way in which these, because photography, you know, is invented in Europe, it's exported there, and then it has to be negotiated and changed. But in those countries, I suppose they get mimicked, and what's at stake with mimicry is then another whole
But I think that's where it starts to work, is because then you say, well, so they're no longer, they're taking on an affect that is sort of performed through the photographic structure that you describe. I mean, they're taking on a performance of civilization or whatever it is through the photograph. That makes sense.
Yeah.
We do have a couple of hands raised. We should be wrapping up. So maybe a couple of quick questions.
Quick question. Going on from what Roger was saying there, if the digital photograph already, you know, it makes apparent quite clearly photographic codes, it's constructive codes fairly clearly, what then could painting do? If that's clear.
I'm not sure that I understand the question.
Does if digital photography already makes apparent all this kind of magic, if you like, it's things. Therefore, the same space that Dumas exploits with the analog photograph is in some ways already done, or it's not quite the same space anymore.
The fact that the digital can also critically engage with the photographic past and with the analog doesn't mean that that's the only way to do it. So I think that what painting does with the photographic archive and record is different. And I suppose you would have to look at each instance, because also with the digital, there'd be many, many instances. I mean, we find, for example, video, where things are animated. Old photographic archives are animated, things begin to move, things begin to be distorted, things dissolve, things get liquefied, and there are many, many ways through digital technologies now that all these archival sources have been opened up and troubled or turned into some kind of lyrical, exegesis. But I think that in each instance, you would have to ask the question, what is it that this technology is doing to this image source? So I think there are multiple things, I would say, that happen. But painting, it's almost kind of weirdly perverse thing of taking a much older technology that predates the photographic by hundreds of years and both invokes it, but at the same time interrogates it. Yeah, I think the digital probably does that differently too, though. Yeah.
Thanks, it was brilliant. I just wondered whether you could comment maybe on the prevalence in the global contemporary of the plundering of the archival beyond Dumas and beyond, just...
The question is whether you think of it as a plunder, or whether you think of it as a kind of reactivation and a resource. Plunder sort of presupposes that somebody is stealing something that's not their own. And I think that there are cases where you might want to argue that that's the case. In fact, the question is, to whom does this image belong? Already there's a politics of the image, isn't there, in the sense that here is this Dutch photographer taking a photograph. He was there, we don't know why, but he was there, takes the photograph, he sells it to United Press International, they sell it to Time magazine, the photograph then gets reproduced in a book or whatever, and photographs have lives. You can read the biography of the object and they have lives, and there's a politics at stake in terms of who has power to take the photograph, who gets paid for it, who's represented in it. So you might say there's a plundering of history, or you might not. You might say that, okay, there's somebody who's there, lucky enough to be there at the time to make the record. But the turn to the archive as part of the global contemporary has been around with us now for the last 20 years or so, and maybe this has to do with the digital and has to do with the way in which images are reproduced, and the image culture is so rich and proliferating all the time. That, what are the materials out of which art is made? And how is the self negotiating its place in relation to the past? Well, one of the resources that has become more and more ubiquitous is the photographic archive. And not only photographs, but also texts and materials from the past. So maybe it's a kind of turn to history, yeah? And how history is understood through material objects. So history becomes encapsulated in these material traces or residues, each of which has their own kind of complex story to tell. So it's like peeling an onion. You can go back and, it's not that you find a source and that was the beginning of something, because the source itself had a source. So I don't have anything more profound to say about that, except that when did Okwe and Wizo Duki do his book on the archival turn? It was 10 or 15 years ago, and there have been exhibitions around that. I got very interested in it in relation to contemporary South African photography, because when I did the project at the V&A that Mark mentioned, and later the one on Distance and Desire, one of the questions for African artists is what to do with the unbelievably vexed history of the colonial archive, which is obviously experienced as something which is an ongoingly oppressive archive. And there are many, many ways in which artists in Africa negotiate that. In the same ways like African American artists are negotiating the slave archive. That's one of the biggest tropes within the work that's emerging out of African American cultures. What do you do with all those histories of, those representations of slavery? Do you say, okay, let's not look at them again, let's put them in a drawer, let's stick them away, those are the subjects of history? Or do you try and remake history in a way with them? And a lot of South African artists have been using them parodically, taking the piss out of them, satirizing them. Zanele Moholi is a classic example. She's a brilliant Zulu lesbian activist and artist who takes the Zulu archive and completely scrambles its code. So, scrambles the gender codes, plays with kind of kitsch, commercialized forms of jewelry and dress, plays with all those tropes of Zuluness as a construct through looking at photographic precedents. And you find a lot, I mean, the other one in the Congo is a brilliant artist called Sami Balochi, who now works with old photographs of colonial, the copper mines, of the people on the copper mines forced to labor to take, copper out of the ground. And he does a whole reworking of those photographs, digitally manipulating them, shifting the landscapes. These are just two examples. There are hundreds of African artists who are working with these kinds of colonial histories.
There are hundreds of artists
in the world.
All the colonies.
But that's why I say that they're part of the global contemporary. I mean, if the world is interested in the archive, then artists in India and Taiwan and Africa and Egypt and Australia and whatever are interested in the archive and how it's mediated. The challenge, and this is what in my work that I do in this extraordinary program called ASICO for African artists and curators, working with a lot of facilitators who come from all over the world, is to think, how do you both register the specificity of where you come from and engage in a world which you have a right to engage with, which is part of a global language? So how do you get that balance? So you don't just sell out on the specific and the local and embrace this kind of the global, but at the same time you don't want to be stuck back in your village as some kind of pastoral fantasy, or doing your stuff. If you want to be a contemporary artist, of course there are many carvers and weavers and mat makers and whatever who are very embedded in traditional ways of working, but for the younger artists, and not only younger artists, for the last 50 years, people have wanted to be part of the global contemporary. And for them it's very important to utilize the technologies and the theories. I mean, they're all reading the same books. I just was in Ethiopia a few weeks ago on this program, and going visiting artist studios, and the bookshelves are exactly the same as the bookshelves in my students' rooms. They're exactly the books that everyone's reading everywhere. No different.
Oh, I'm not even sure that's a note of total
photographs
optimism, but it is
I've got
still.
photographs of the bookshelves, and I'm so fascinated by that. I'm happy to share them.
Well, look, I thank you so much both for your wonderful paper, but also for your generous response to the questions, which really provoked further discussions. And thank you very much indeed. Thank you.